Hi, today I'm going to show you a technique that we teach in several of our patterns. It's how to make continuous bias binding or bias tape. Bias binding or bias tape can be used to finish necklines, armholes. It can also be used in Hong Kong finishes, and it can be used to bind edges of really delicate garments as well as heavier garments. So it's an important thing to know how to do, and this technique makes it much simpler to make bias binding because you're not having to piece together all those little strips. It is one continuous length, and this is the only way that I make bias tape now. So first I am starting with a rectangle of fabric. This is about 12 inches by 18 inches. And it can be a square or a rectangle, and it doesn't have to be very large. So this is a great way to use up scrap fabric that you have. And you start by taking one corner and folding it over to make a 45-degree angle. And then you're going to cut along this edge, this 45-degree angle. So I'm going to do that, and then I will show you what to do next. Now I'm going to take this triangle of fabric that I cut out, and I'm going to put it on this edge over here. And again, I keep right sides together, and so I just turned it, right sides are together, and I'm going to sew from here all the way down to here. You can use a 1/4 inch seam allowance or a 1/2 inch seam allowance, whatever you want to do. I'm probably going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It just uses up a little less fabric, and then you have a little less bulk in your bias. So now I've sewn the 1/4 inch seam here. I'm going to press this open and press the seam open on this side, and then I'll show you what to do next. So I've flipped over the trapezoid that I've now made, and you can see that I've pressed the seam allowance open. I want to make bias binding that's 2 inches wide, so when it's folded it will be 1 inch. And and so you can choose whatever size you want to do. If you want narrower, you can do narrow. If you're doing double folded, so if you're using 2 inch and you folded each side in by a 1/2 inch and then fold it in half, you're going to end up with a 1/2 inch bias binding. My binding is just going to be folded in half one time. It's going to be binding the edge of a garment. So I want the bias binding to be about 1 inch wide. So I have plenty of room for a seam allowance, as well as then to fold it in and bind the seam. So I'm doing 2 inches. So what you're going to do is whatever width you want your bias binding to be, have a ruler out that you can then measure off and mark each width. So I'm going to start here, and then I move it over and make another 2 inch wide strip, and then another 2 inch wide strip until I've used the whole piece up. I've finished marking off my 2 inch sections on this piece of fabric. I'm left with about 1 inch, a little over 1 inch left on one side. I'm just going to trim that off really quickly. So I've turned the fabric around, so I'm not working with the end where the seam allowance is. And I'm going to mark an X on this one at this end, and I'm going to mark another X on this end, 1 over. And this is to give just a marker, because what we're going to do is then right sides together, put these two X's together. So there's an X there and an X there, and I'm going to start pinning this together to make a tube of fabric. And I'm going to try to keep the marked lines together. Until I've made a whole tube of fabric. And it looks a little funny, almost like they don't quite match up, but at the seam allowance line where you're going to be sewing, they do. So I'm ending here, and now I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this pinned line, and we'll have a tube of bias fabric to then start cutting apart. I've sewn the seam and I've made this tube of bias fabric, and now I'm going to just cut along the line, and this is now a spiral. So there is no, it's just a continuous loop of bias binding, and you just need to cut all the way around until the end. And now I have this nice continuous strip of bias binding. I'm gonna now fold it in half to make a bias binding that's just 1 inch wide, but you can use a bias tape maker and make double fold bias tape. I'll show you. So this is a bias tape maker. They come in several different sizes. This is a 1/2 inch bias tape maker, a 12 millimeter. We sell several in our shop that are 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 inch. So you basically start by putting one end of the bias strip into the maker from the large end, and then there's this convenient way you can get a pin to push the fabric through till you have a corner to pull on, and then you pull the fabric. And sometimes it takes a little bit of effort, but pull the fabric through, and I like to start about 1 inch or so along the fabric. Sometimes you have to start over if it doesn't cooperate, but as it comes out, it folds so you can have a 1/2 inch double-sided bias, and you just use an iron and press this as you're pulling the fabric through. I've now folded my bias tape, and I have quite a bit of binding to use, and just pretty obvious, but the larger the fabric piece the larger the fabric square or rectangle you use at the beginning, the longer the bias strips you make. And this is just a really easy way to put lots of them together to make long bias bindings. Hope you've enjoyed it.